In this short video, I just want to highlight some key aspects or unique issues that come up as we talk about the background of John. One of the things that you want to be aware of is when we talk about history, in our culture, we talk about something that we can confirm as fact, something that's been written and observed and has been recorded. And we would all acknowledge that history is always biased. It's written by the winners, and it's interpreted by whoever writes it. And if we had been standing next to the historian, we may have absolutely seen something completely different and would have penned it in a different fashion. So we just need to acknowledge that there's no such thing as an objective history. Every history is colored by the lenses that are worn by the historian himself or herself. So be aware that we all have biases and that every history in some way, shape, or form is biased. Having said that, when we look at John, are we really encountering objective history? Some people would say, absolutely. John was written word for word just like it happened. And yet we acknowledge in our own experience that that's not usually how history comes to be. So when we talk about John as a book of history, we need to kind of understand that John is writing things from his perspective. John is writing things that are important to him. John and his group are editing things in and out as they see fit. So be aware that John's history and John's gospel are not a chronological history as we would expect it to be. And we need to kind of adjust our expectations based on that understanding. Now, another question that usually comes up when discussing John is, was John written as a symbolic history or a regular history? Again, I don't think that everything in it is symbolic about Jesus. I think Jesus did the miracles. I think Jesus did the teachings. I think he had conflict, real conflict with Judaism. I think he did speak to people like Nicodemus and the woman at the well. I think he had private conversations with the disciples. I think he did these things. So in that sense, it's more than just symbolic. It is definitely historical. The question is, are all the details historical? And at some point, we can't prove that, and then it becomes a statement of faith. You can either say, I do believe that it happened as such, or there's wiggle room in there for whatever amount of faith you might be willing to have in the story. Now, I want you to know that I don't believe we should use the word symbolic. I don't believe we should use the word fiction. I don't even think that the word mythical really covers everything that John is going for. I think John is recording real moments in time of the ministry of Jesus with real connections with real people. So again, we need to be clear on what we mean by history and understand that your authors in your textbooks don't always view history and John's gospel the same as you might. So you're going to just need to kind of work through some of their biases in order to get to information that may be of value to you. But just beware that the question, is John historical? That's a question that quite a few of our folks deal with. Now, you've got some authors who deal with it differently. You've got an author like C.K. Barrett who's going to say John's book is interpreted history, which means he saw the events, but he's adding his own interpretation to them, expanding them, providing a different light, a more theological perspective, if you will, so that his readers might reach an intended goal or purpose through the writing itself. Some people like J.L. Martin and our author, Mr. or Dr. Brown, have what we call a diachronic approach. And they view the story of Jesus on two different levels as they read John. So when you read Raymond Brown, you're going to find that he sees that there's a level of the story that speaks about Jesus and his day, and then there's going to be a second level of the story in which John is interpreting the level for his people, so that Raymond Brown is going to give you two interpretations in a lot of passages. What Jesus originally did, and then how John later wrote about it and interpreted the passage for his people. So two levels, a diachronic meaning. Some, like R. Allen Culpepper, simply have a synchronic approach. He just sees one layer of meaning. And for Culpepper, it's going to be the layer of meaning for John's community. And he doesn't believe that there's really any history of, there's not real history of Jesus here. It's just John knew of Jesus, but his story is really based on the needs of his people and not necessarily on the reality of what Jesus did. Now, I don't really buy into that kind of synchronic approach. The diachronic approach, I think, has some value because it recognizes the history of the originality of Jesus' teachings. And then it also recognizes the layers of editorial stuff that happened with John and his followers as they brought everything together. Now, you may prefer a synchronic approach, which states that it's all about Jesus. It was all in his time. It's accurately reflected from day one. And your synchronic approach will say that John or the editors had no impact whatsoever in the document. It simply is a recording, almost verbatim, of what really happened in Jesus' day. If you take that synchronic approach, that is great. Just be able to defend it, because not everybody's going to agree with you on it. And your authors may disagree. So be aware, you may have one approach, your authors may have another approach. Our goal here is to understand our authors, know where they're coming from, and know why we believe what we believe in light of their arguments and their statements. All right? So again, I'm okay with your faith statement, I'm okay with your belief, but be prepared to defend what you believe. That's the key to what we do here. Be prepared to defend it as we work through the information at hand. Now, as we continue on thinking about John and history, I think there's some great evidence within the book that John was very much aware of the topography and the geography of Jerusalem. He knows Bethany, he knows Jacob's well, he knows Solomon's porch, he knows the pool of Bethesda, he understands there's a walkway to Pilate's palace, he knows where the treasure is located and what it looks like. He's very aware that the Sea of Galilee is also called the Sea of Tiberias. There's some things within the gospel that show that John lived in the day, walked the same places that Jesus walked, and uses different terms that the other Gospels use, a very, very personal perspective on it. So I think that, if anything, we can affirm that John was definitely involved in the life of Jesus and very aware of the geography and topography. So in terms of his being an eyewitness to the testimony, I don't think there's any question that John's historical approach is that of an eyewitness. Also, we do see some elements that lend a time flow to what is happening in the story, so that we'll see that John often will use phrases like the next day, 2 days later, a short time later, or even term like an hour or the hour of Jesus' ministry. So we see that there are time aspects, but again, I wouldn't say chronology. I would simply say he's trying to communicate there is a sequence of the themes, a sequence of events. This event occurs, and then a couple days later, this event occurs. So don't get hung up on the chronology. Be aware that we're talking about moments in time that relate to one another, and he often uses these phrases like the next day, the next week, the next something. He'll use these transition phrases to introduce a new section and relate in some form or fashion how these events work together. Some other aspects of his eyewitness account would be that he calls himself a witness in chapter 19, verse 35, and chapter 21, verse 24. He also calls John the Baptist a witness. He also calls Jesus a witness. He even calls God the Father a witness. So by calling himself a witness as an author, he's really putting himself in good company here, saying that I have the authority from Jesus, from the Father, even from the Old Testament prophets as represented by John the Baptist. There's authority for me to be doing this, and I am a witness, a testimony giver of what is happening. So he certainly, the author asserts himself in a very high place in terms of the value of what he is writing down. Another issue besides history that we're going to be looking at, and that your books will look at, is that of the relationship between John and the Synoptics. We'll see similarities in the stories and the presentations. We see similarities in the Passion narrative, especially where John and the Synoptics record many of the same basic events and the same flow of events in the death and resurrection of Jesus. We see similarity in the overall ministry. We see the Synoptics and John both talking about John the Baptist feeding the 5,000, the confession of Peter, Jesus and the disciples at the Sea of Galilee, entry into Jerusalem, the last meal. There are some very clear elements where the gospel narrative is equal in all four of our gospels. And yet, if we take a closer look, we do need to know that John is also producing a gospel perspective that is different. His miracles are placed in different locations. Several of his miracles are unique to his gospel. There are some aspects in which he addresses, for example, he addresses the cleansing of the temple at the beginning of his gospel and not towards the end as the synoptic gospels do. An interesting issue there. that we'll have to address when we look at John chapter 2. John does not speak of a virgin birth. He does not talk about the baptism or the temptation. There is no transfiguration listed. Demons and lepers are not cured in his gospel. There are a lack of parables. The Lord's Supper is not even instituted in his gospel. The Garden of Gethsemane does not appear in John's gospel. The ascension is not contained in the gospel. So there are several elements that we know by heart are a part of the gospel story that are not in John's gospel. Why? Well, as we walk through the gospel, we can talk about some of these things. Knowing the purpose, knowing the general background of the book will help you ascertain why John skipped some of these elements and instead emphasized other elements. One thing I think we can assume is that John knows that his reader is already very aware of some of these issues and doesn't feel the need to address them. The issue of the temptation, the issue of the virgin birth, the issue of the Lord's Supper. These are not things that need to be addressed for his audience. They're already very well aware of them, perhaps, and they don't need to be talked about. So instead, he emphasizes something else instead of those things for his gospel. To me, that makes sense in addressing the omissions, but there may be some other things that come up as you read in your textbooks as to why some of these omissions are there. So just be aware that John and the Synoptics have a different take. They have a different path they travel. And John has added some things, the resurrection of Lazarus, the story of Nicodemus, the story of the Samaritan woman, washing of the feet, farewell discourse. There are some things that are very important to his gospel that the other gospels don't have. If we understand why they're important to John, we have a better clue about what his purpose might be. So keep in mind, the uniqueness of John is not a problem. It is an opportunity for us to understand his purpose better and understand his perspective better. So just keep that in mind as you're working through the book. Again, some people will talk about John and the Synoptics and how they relate to one another. Let me just give you 4 ways in which people theorize how they relate. Some people say that John was written after the Synoptic Gospels in order to give information they didn't give, to supplement them, or in order to interpret them. For a new generation, John comes out with a new vision that's meant to interpret those other Gospels, to give a new generation a better understanding of the story. Others say that John and the Synoptics just simply take the same traditions and interpret them differently. So that's really just 2 different perspectives on one gospel story. Others say that John is simply independent. John didn't know about the Synoptics. He doesn't borrow them. He never read them. He just simply wrote his own story, and therefore there's no dependence, there's no relationship whatsoever, that John is here and the Synoptics are here, and the 2 must remain separate. The final way of looking at the relationship is that the original Gospels were written, but they were incomplete. John's Gospel came along and was a better Gospel and replaces them. And there are some Christian communities throughout history who have taken John's Gospel as the only authority because the Synoptic Gospels didn't have the key elements that John did. Now, that's few and far between, but it has happened. So you've got a supplemental relationship. You have an option of a similar tradition relationship. You've got an independent relationship. And then you've got a replacement relationship. Really, the answer is probably somewhere in between, but I go for number 2, that they interpret similar traditions but with different perspectives so that they complement one another rather than supplement or even replace. We have to have all 4. I don't think we can throw out one of the Synoptics or John and keep the other. I think we need all of them to get the best, fullest picture possible. So be aware that there will be some debate about how the Synoptics and the Gospel of John relate to one another, and I think you're going to need to be able to decide which one you believe so that you can better handle your interpretations as you move forward and also better understand your textbooks.